Welcome to the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast. I'm Pat Kahnke, and I'm joined once again today by Pastor Dave Johnson. He's formerly the pastor of Church of the Open Door in Minneapolis, and now he's the head of a ministry for pastors and church leaders called Things That Remain. And good to see you, Dave.
Good to see you too, Pat.
Back from Arizona or wherever you were.
We were in Arizona with some friends, did some ministry stuff out there, had a retreat. And Bonnie and I drove. We took a week to get back, went through Zion National Park and a couple other places in Utah. It was amazing. So, but it is good to be back. Really good to be
back in God's
again.
Country.
And
So Dave and I have been talking through Matthew Taylor's book, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that's threatening our democracy. It's a great book. And we're going through it chapter by chapter because Matthew Taylor, I think, has given us a gold mine of information here about the new apostolic reformation. And these folks are like a certain type of Christian nationalism. And we're going to get into that more today about where Matthew Taylor takes this to actually Christian supremacy. We're going to get into that today. That's part of what we're going to talk about. But this movement is steeped in teachings about how God has called Christians to sort of dominate every aspect of our society. And this movement is energized by prophecies and is run by people who call themselves apostles. Some of the prophecies involve Donald Trump supposedly being God's chosen man for America. And this movement is important because it's growing, and they actually played a role in like the January 6th riot. And they believe they played an important role in making Donald Trump president. And Donald Trump is giving them a prominent place in the culture by publicly kind of cozying up to them. So I have a couple of concerns about this, like two types of concerns that Dave and I have talked about. One is that I'm concerned about the damage that these people are doing to our nation. That's sort of like the American citizen part of me that's concerned about that. But I'm also concerned about the damage that Donald Trump is doing to Christians by elevating these people. So the fact that they're close to him and he says, these are my chosen, Christians, raises them up. And I think they're just a dangerous movement. So that's kind of why we're talking about this stuff. So, I think that you'll notice that Dave and I aren't given like a full summary of these chapters. Because nothing replaces reading the book, but we look at the issues that are raised in these chapters and we talk about them. So I just hope you find the discussions helpful in that way, because there's a lot of really important stuff here and some important alarms that are being raised. So Dave, why don't you jump into this chapter? It's called The Second Apostolic Age. It's chapter 4. And why don't you give us your thoughts on it so far?
Well, the overall thing, thanks, Pat. The overall thing of this chapter is a focus on a guy by the name of Che An. He's a Korean pastor. He came here as a kid from South Korea with his dad. And he is presently the pastor of Harvest Rock Church, but also Harvest International Ministry. And one of the things that you and I were talking about before we even got on the air here, Pat, was, why would we care about who this guy is?
Right.
And it's really consistent with the whole book, because Taylor's primary point is to help us see that there's something going on here that none of us kind of knew about.
Right.
And if you've never heard of Che An, hadn't either, but he's got, in 2008, his ministry, Harvest International Ministry, had 8,000 churches globally, or ministries of some sort. In 2015, 20,000, not just people going to his church, but 20,000 churches, ministries of various sorts around the globe. And in the present day, 2025, it's 25,000 churches. So that's at least part of the answer as to why we would be noticing a guy like this. Ironic, isn't it, though, that most mainline evangelicals never heard of this guy?
Right. Yeah. Somebody So
Go ahead.
powerful. Yeah,
Yes.
somebody so powerful, so prominent in a certain uh, wing of the church
Yep.
that many others had never heard of.
Right. Another thing I noticed, Pat, in this chapter, and we can talk on this briefly, but not a lot, but it's because we've talked about Peter Wagner before.
Mhm.
I feel like this chapter there was a shift in Wagner. I've kind of been defending him
Mhm.
as this good-hearted. He just follows. He's very pragmatic, and his connection with Wimber, he saw that as a way with the gifts of the Spirit being added to his social science application of things in the culture to help churches grow.
Right.
He was good-hearted and he was just following. If it works, we're going to do it. And he might, get in trouble from time to time, but he's basically a good guy. And I'm not saying he's a bad guy now, but the
Right.
shift
Right.
I discerned in this chapter was it all kind of pivoted on the Toronto blessing. That's
Yes.
when Bill
Yes.
Johnson from Bethel got interested and he wanted to form his whole church after the Toronto blessing, like bring that back. And it did. It made the church get really big down in Redding, California, is one of the things. But John Wimber at the time was pulling back from that. And
Mhm.
he said, there's some excess here that he wasn't comfortable with. And Wagner and Wimber had been really tight.
Mhm.
If you remember from from previous episodes and even chapters in the book, Wimber really helped Wagner open up to the reality of the gifts of the Spirit. But this is in this chapter. It's where when Wimber has a hesitation to go further into this, what it ultimately became the NAR and its iteration that showed up on January 6th.
Mhm.
Wagner said goodbye to Wimber and kept following. And that's where he began to
Right.
deal with Cindy Jacobs, who we talked about last time, but also now Che An and Lou Engle is another
Right.
guy who's kind of connected to Pastor or Apostle Che An as well. And what bothered me about that, this is kind of personal, but I remember when the Wimber thing, I'm calling it the Wimber thing because it really was kind of a third wave. Back in the late 80s, there were a number of us. I was an evangelical pastor who was very negative on the gifts of the Spirit, and people like Wimber helped open my eyes, I think, and
Mhm.
open me up to the gifts of the Spirit and the reality of them for today. But I also, I remember coming home, and then there'd be something in town here, and there was this thing that started happening where everybody, even not everybody, but people in our church and myself included, we always were seeking this experience. Where is
Mhm.
it now? Oh, let's go over there and find it over there. And they're chasing this experience. They're chasing revival. Okay, well, that's a good thing, but chasing it is careful what you're chasing, what you're seeking. And I think Wagner got caught up in the chasing of the sensational more than chasing after God. Isn't it the same? No, it's
Right.
not. Because I think there's people here who are using God to get power, to get revival. Revival is good, but if you're not worshiping God, you're using God. The prosperity theology, the easiest thing there to say is they're
Mhm.
using God to get the American dream. That
Right.
isn't Christianity. And
Right.
so that's where I really kind of felt yuck about Wagner relative to that, because I think he just kept on seeking that thing that became, and he's dead now. So maybe he would look at it now and go, "Oh, I wish I hadn't done that." I don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
Although he
but that
did
was
vote
one of
for
the things
Donald
I
Trump
noticed. Go
on
ahead.
his he did vote for Donald Trump on his deathbed too. So
Yeah, yeah,
if I
yeah.
remember that story right.
Okay.
So
Thanks
yeah,
for that,
so
Peter.
yeah, and so one of the things that this chapter points out, just to put us in, kind of center us in this whole story, is that uh, Matthew Taylor writes that the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, which this book is all about, is grounded on this three-legged stool. He calls it. There's like three core uh, parts, three core legs of the NAR, and the first one we talked about the last episode, which was Peter Wagner, who you just talked about, who started the NAR, and others engaging in what they call strategic level spiritual warfare. So that's the first leg of the stool. And so all the spiritual warfare stuff around the world, and we talked all about that last time. So the second leg is what we're talking about today, which is the NAR believes very strongly in governance of churches by prophets and apostles, and Taylor calls it a spiritual oligarchy. So we're going to get into that, and I find it really troubling. And we're going to talk about wherever you want to go with that, Dave, to describe that. And then the third one, the third leg of this stool, is what we'll get into starting next week with the next chapter, when it gets into the 7 mountains theology and stuff, which is basically this really aggressive political theology. So the 3 legs of the NAR are this whole focus on spiritual warfare, strategic spiritual warfare for the world. Then second, governing churches by prophets and apostles. That's today. And then next week, this aggressive political thing that starts to come out of it. So I just wanted to ground us there.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Yeah. Well, I think the second apostolic age, which is what this chapter is about, he does get into this thing about church governance. And from the beginning of the book that you and I have been talking about, this is kind of where Wagner started with he was kind of anti-denominational. As a young pastor, I don't know about you, Pat. We didn't know each other when we were first starting out. But I was kind of too, because denominations are restrictive. They had all these laws and rules, and this is the only theology you can think. And so denominations are slow. And Wagner was really rallying a lot of younger people going into ministry who were wanting to grow churches. And it really gave life to a lot of the mega churches. I think we even mentioned Saddleback. Come on.
Rick Warren.
Rick Warren, is a really good guy, but they were applying social science theory to churches and how you get more people to come, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So denominations are bad. The other form of church governance would be pastoral rule, where the pastor is the guy. I think Taylor even defined it as a pastoral dictatorship.
Right.
Like I'm the guy.
Which we've all seen. We've all seen this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wrote a book on spiritual abuse, and it's one of the chapters had to do with, because I'm the pastor, that's why. Right. Meaning the only reason we're doing what we're doing, and I don't care what you think, is because I'm the pastor, and because I'm the pastor, I get to say, and it just becomes, it's obviously a seed bed for spiritual abuse, because that's all power over, and I can decide. The third form of governance that Taylor identifies is, and this is another place that just goes crazy on the opposite direction, and that is congregational democracy, where everything is voted on. And if you can just slow everything down to nothing, it's like, but then, so that's, some pastors have been in that at Open Door. When I first came to Open Door, it was congregational rule. And I remember being in a quarterly meeting, where I had to leave the room and they were going to vote on whether I was going to make enough money to put gas in my car.
Right. Yep. That's sort of the stream I've been from too.
Yes.
Yeah. Some variant of that stream. Yeah.
Yeah. And we could talk for a long time about how, where the people in the church who wanted the power would come to that meeting and they would vote and get what they wanted. And the people who just cared about what God was doing, they didn't ever even care about that kind of control and stuff. Right. That's a whole nother podcast. But the fourth one that you just touched on, Pat, that Taylor is identifying as being consistent with this apostolic thing, is what he calls the spiritual oligarchy.
Yeah.
And it kind of is a different version of pastoral rule, except the oligarchy, it's not just one pastor who's ruling over his church like a dictator. This is a group of apostles who have been identified by themselves as apostolic or prophetic, and they have all the authority. And it just is this system where these guys, and it is a little scary. At one level, you're kind of going, you should be able to trust these people. Well, I have all sorts of reasons why I wouldn't trust them.
Right.
I mean, really specific, like you got to quit having sex with people who aren't your wife kinds of reasons. I don't.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of very non-controversial ways of judging,
Yes.
assessing what they're doing and saying,
Because you can't do
okay,
any
this isn't
wrong,
right.
and people come under
Yeah.
that authority. And again, seedbed of abuse is all over the place. But it's like they hear directly from God, and so that's where their authority is. So
Right.
anyway.
Yeah. It's interesting when I heard about this spiritual oligarchy. I mean, when he was describing it, I was thinking, before he used the term, I was thinking, this seems like a spiritual oligarchy to me. And then it's like, oh, and then he uses the term, and
You should maybe define oligarchy, because now
yeah, so
everybody's walking around, oh, that sounds like an oligarchy.
right. So that's what I'm just going to do here is that,
Yeah, okay.
like, the oligarchy, like we're seeing now in, people are protesting. And I was out actually this past week protesting the oligarchy of the wealthy who are basically sidling up to Trump and are the ones pulling the strings, starting with Elon Musk and that sort of thing. And I don't mean this in a conspiratorial way. I mean, people that he's identified as, like, these are the people who have billions of dollars. He's putting a bunch of them in his cabinet. He seated a bunch of them behind him in the speech that he gave when he was, at the inauguration, and it reflects what's going on in Russia, where Putin has, he's a dictator, but he has all of these very wealthy people around him whose power depends upon him. He decides whether they're in or out of the oligarchy, but then they wield vast power and they have vast wealth. And the whole country of Russia works for their benefit. So the people in Russia live in poverty generally, and then you've got these very wealthy oligarchs on top. So that's like a political oligarchy, and that's what is starting to happen more. It's always been there, but it's happening more, I would say, under the Trump administration. And that's this is a spiritual form of that we're seeing, where they self-select. You've got one guy who starts something. He selects the people himself who are going to be the ones who hold him accountable, and then they empower each other. They agree never to speak against each other in public, which is a very real problem when somebody starts going off the rails. Like, oh, we'll never. That's what you saw happen in the Lakeland, Florida thing that you and I talked about a few weeks ago, where nobody would speak in public about their concerns. And so everybody in public is just saying, well, all of these people seem to think this guy is okay, and it ends up being ripe for abuse. It's not a dictatorship of one, but it's kind of a dictatorship of several. So Dave, you want to pick up on this whole idea of how this kind of spiritual oligarchy that Taylor's describing in the New Apostolic Reformation, how that works? And yeah.
Well, it's just that all the power is centered in these few, and I find it dangerous, and I think on the front end it might sound okay, but yeah, well, this is weird because I have a personal experience. My daughters actually went to Master's Commission, which was a discipleship thing out of Mike Bickle's church before he started IHOP. And I remember going there and meeting Mike, and there were a couple other people who were over the school that I really trusted. And Mike, I met him for lunch or something like that. But I remember being in the service, loved the worship, but I remember thinking I could not be part of a church that was prophetically driven, because because I mean, I would be nervous actually if I was in a church where we had kind of shut down the whole prophetic thing. No, we don't hear from God. God doesn't speak to us anymore. Actually, in 1 Thessalonians 5:20, I think it is, Paul very explicitly says to the Thessalonians, and they were kind of struggling with what are the appropriate expressions of supernatural communication from God to people. Paul said, do not despise prophetic utterance. Stop right there. Why would he need to warn us not to despise them? Here's why, because sometimes they sound stupid. And Paul's going, don't just decide that just because it sounds a little out there, that it's wrong. Don't not despise prophetic utterance. Rather, examine everything carefully. What's that? Discernment. You don't just because he said it, we do it. No, you don't. Examine everything carefully and cling to what is good. And I suppose that in that discernment of what is good, there is a collective kind of wisdom that, with a lot of eyes on it, that are objective and wanting to hear God, there can come this sense of, yeah, this is from God. So we're not going to throw out the prophetic, but I'm not giving it all to one person.
Yeah.
Or even a small group of people who think they are the prophets and everything they say we do, I'm not doing it.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I view it too. And my concern is that, what the system that they've put in place, that Wagner put in place, and then Che An, who this chapter is about, and others, is when they self-select the people who get to be part of their board, basically, who are then leading thousands and thousands, even millions of people. And they've self-selected the people who get to weigh the prophecies. There's this incentive structure built into that, wow, I want to be part of this whole board. If I start getting out of line and challenging, it depends on who these people are inside this board. We can see where it would happen, where I'm not going to speak out about this guy. I'm not going to say this is crazy. I'm not going to, because then I'm going to lose my place in the oligarchy. I'm just going to be cast into the outer darkness. But what it does is that discernment you're talking about, it removes it from anybody who's just in the congregation, anybody who's following these people. They're completely in the dark about this process of discernment that's going on, where these people are saying, is this from God? Is it not? And I think that's very dangerous. It's ripe for abuse.
Well, let me just add to the fuel of that, because I do think it's dangerous. Because if you've got people saying, "Thus saith the Lord," and I'm not part of the oligarchy, I'm just one of the people, and I go, I'm not sure that's from God. The problem that you have, if the oligarchy is all powerful, you're not just disagreeing with Bob. You're not just disagreeing with Mike Bickle or Che An. You're disagreeing with God, because thus saith the Lord. Don't agree. Don't argue with me. You got your problems with God, because this is what God has said. And I would run for my life. Run for your life.
Yeah, and there's a quote that, we keep bringing up C. Peter Wagner. For people where this is the first video you're watching, I'm sorry, but he's all through the book. But he was the founder of this movement, and he had this quote from this chapter where he said that God is increasing the amount of spiritual authority delegated by the Holy Spirit to individuals. So he just decided this. C. Peter Wagner decided God is increasing the spiritual authority in certain individuals, that in this age he's delegating more of his spiritual authority than he has in the past to certain individuals. And
to be fair to Wagner, he did say that, but it's not just him. That's that whole latter rain thing.
Right.
There's a movement before all of them that kind of fed into this. And anyway.
So yeah, right. He was speaking out of that understanding. That's true. And to me, that point of view is it's very arrogant, I think, to make a pronouncement that God's like increasingly doing something like this now, that basically disempowers like the people in the congregation, disempowers their ability to discern, and says, unless you're one of these elite that God is choosing now to speak more through these elite, then you don't really have any leg to stand on if you're going to challenge us. I think it's a dangerous way of framing that sort of thing up.
Another reason, 100%, another part of the danger of that is that if you're giving those kind of pronouncements, it's like just being a person in the pew who wants to be part of what God's doing. And if that's what God's doing, I want to be part of that. So you don't want to be the person who's always sitting back there going, I don't think this is true. So there's this kind of built-in, not so subtle pressure to keep going along with whatever the so-called prophets or apostles dictate to us. What God is doing in the world, what he's doing right now with us. And if I want to be part of what God's doing, then I got to jump on that train.
Right.
No, you don't.
Right. Yeah, and I want to say I might have said that, I mean I said this, but it was probably at the point when I was offline. So I'll say it again here. And the I think that there's a pattern with a lot of the people who support, say, Donald Trump, and all the people who support Trump, like that, the oligarchs around him. There's a pattern where people do the same thing in the spiritual world. There's a certain type of person who just, I think, naively trusts the leaders of their movement, and they can say all the leaders of this other movement are just terrible. They're terrible. But if they say the right things, if they wear a cross around their neck, or if they say, I'm one of you, I'm a Christian, and I'm working for you in the government. So whether it's in the church or in the government, there's a naivete about the fallenness of their own leaders, and there's a trust that they put in them that I think is unwarranted. That kind of allows this to happen, where it's like, well, they're good guys. I'm sure that they're, and I just think people need to be a little less naive about that in judging their own. People need to be more critical of their own leaders than they are being.
Yeah, and I think it's not just critical of them. Like, I don't want that. You've had people critical of you, and it's like, go away, go to another church if you don't like it here. In some ways,
Maybe discerning about is a
discerning
better.
about. I do
Yeah.
think that the people who can get caught up, they're not very literate biblically. I mean,
Right.
they love Jesus as much as they know how to, and it's
Hmm.
part of their openness to stuff is what makes them easy pickings, I'm afraid, for some of these
Right.
kinds of things, because there's this voice of authority that they haven't taken the time to get into the weeds of what the story of God and the gospel actually
Hmm.
is, and this whole declaration that there's a second apostolic age. Who decided what? Where did
Right.
and you decide? So let's go along with it, because I don't want to miss out on what God's doing. So I will just turn off my own blinders and
Right.
capacity to discern, to be on the train to what is it they call it? The fear of missing out. The
Yeah.
What is it?
FOMO. Yeah.
FOMO. Yes,
Yeah.
fear of missing out. I don't want to miss out on what God's doing. So I will shut down my own discernment and my own need to search the scriptures to see what is so.
Right.
And they use scripture, so you better be good with the scriptures, because they use it all the time.
Oh, right. Right.
They just twist it.
Hmm. Yeah. So let's get into then this whole, you know, I'm not sure exactly what you want to say about Che-An, how much you want to say about him. Do you want to tell more of his story, or should I go into basically this question that I got to that Taylor asked, that Matthew
Okay.
Taylor asked, which was basically, so how did this Pasadena-based, Toronto-blessed global leader in the NAR end up on that stage on January 5th, spiritually stumping for the election-denying Donald Trump? And that's the connection in this movement that I just think is troubling to me, But it's like, what do you see from your reading here? Like what's the connection? Why did he do this? Why did he end up in this camp?
Why did Che-An?
Yeah, why did Che-An
Well, I
and
can go
yeah,
back in the story. I remember
yeah,
in the early part of the chapter, Che-An and Engel,
hmm,
Engels had a desire. They were. In fact, I think it was their story that kind of helped me dial into this mentality that is constantly seeking after revival.
hmm,
They wanted to start a church, and they wanted it to be sensational. They wanted it to be about the nations. A characteristic of the charismatic thing
hmm,
that Taylor has identified is a constant desire for revival, which isn't a bad thing as long as you're not manipulating it and making it happen some way
hmm,
by pulling all the levers the right way. But I think it was their passion for seeking that out, and the catalyst for them, is that, if I remember right, was the Toronto blessing.
hmm. It was,
And they had this, they heard about it, actually, I think, and then
hmm,
they were floundering in a church they had tried to start. They only had 500 people. That's not a failure
yeah.
story.
That's a lot bigger
But
than
they were
any
very
church I would.
frustrated
Yeah,
because it wasn't big enough. It wasn't sensational enough. heard about the Toronto blessing. And if I have the story right, some of that stuff was breaking out at Wimber's church. And John at that time was still going, yeah, this is fine. And then he drew a line someplace. But Che and Ingalls went to that and started their own church kind of based on that. Mm-hmm. And it created some problems for them when Wimber said, no, he kind of pulled away from that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was 3 or 4 months, something like that, after Che started his own church, which was, what was it? The
Harvest International.
Yes, Harvest International, but it started with the Harvest Rock Church that the Vineyard pulled away. And so they were kind of orphaned in some ways. And so you can understand maybe how some of the alliances then changed from being with John Wimber. Now he's with Wagner, and Cindy Jacobs came into that mix along with, Che Ahn at the same time. And then it just kind of went from there. I think we did answer the question, how could they have such influence with just the sheer size of the organization, 25,000 churches around the world. And I can hear people just going, well, 25,000, how can you argue with that success? That's obviously God. No, not necessarily.
Yeah, and I think the answer to the question that Taylor asked, I think he's going to answer it really specifically in the next chapter, which is when we get into the Seven Mountains theology. But he hints at it towards the end of this chapter, where Taylor writes about how this NAR movement and Che Ahn, and in this chapter, are not exactly Christian nationalists. They're like, Christian nationalism is like a light version of what these people are. I mean, it would encompass what they are, would encompass Christian nationalism, but it's beyond that. And he calls it Christian supremacy. It's not so much about focusing on one nation, the way that nationalism does, but it's Christian supremacy over all things. Where, and I think that you mentioned a quote. I think you could find it before I could, about where he links, where Che Ahn talks about Donald Trump being like the vehicle, being the. Do you want to find that quote?
Yes,
because
I have it right
feel
in
like
front
that's
of
sort of at the core of
maybe we can. This will actually kick us into the next chapter pretty well. But on page 37, here's the quote. We are going to. This is Che Ahn saying, we are going to rule and reign through Donald Trump under the lordship of Christ. And then Taylor, responding to that quote, says that on there is imagining a future where Christians pull all the levers of power in America, hoping for miraculous intervention on behalf of Trump. Now, contextualize that. The miraculous intervention on behalf of Trump was back in 2020 when they thought the election had been stolen. So they're praying for this intervention. That's how they were there on January 6th. Divine intervention on behalf of Donald Trump, what he called a divine coronation of Donald Trump, to bring about the height of Christian privilege and power in the U.S. Let me read that again. That this coronation of Donald Trump that would bring about the height of Christian privilege and power in the U.S. Privilege and power, I want to sit on that word. What is power? What is greatness in the kingdom of God? Let's talk about that. Because don't listen to me. I mean, the disciples, it just was fascinating to me. Before any of this stuff was on the screen, on the radar for any of us in our culture, just as a pastor preaching through the text, it was fascinating to me how the disciples kept missing what Jesus meant by what he said about various things. And one of them had to do with power. And there were at least 3 times, and one of them actually was at the Last Supper, which means that right to the end, they didn't get it. And what they came to Jesus with was this question: who then is greatest who's the greatest in the kingdom? What does greatness look like in the kingdom of God? Now, first thing to say about that is that's not a bad question. That's a really good question to ask. What does greatness look like in the kingdom of God? Does it look like the power and greatness that we would measure greatness as being in the culture? But the problem was they weren't actually asking him a legitimate question.
Right.
I think it's in Mark, it indicates that they were arguing amongst themselves who who the greatest was. So they all came to Jesus asking this question about greatness and power with an opinion about who was the greatest. They didn't want an answer to the question. They wanted him to solve the argument, like tell us who is right. Because I think Peter might have thought he was the greatest because he walked on water, and John thought he might have been the greatest because he was the big lover of everyone, and blah 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 blah. They all had an opinion. So Jesus, we'll submit to you. You tell us, what does greatness look like? How will we spot it when we see it? And you know what he does, right? Mm-hmm. He pulls out a guy who's got 25,000. No, he doesn't. He pulls out a little child and says, unless you become like this child, unless you are converted, like you turn in a major way and become like this child, you not only are not great in the kingdom, you won't even enter the kingdom. And if I was a disciple, okay, just be there. I love preaching this because I imagine Jesus taking a little child, and the Greek word is paideon, and it indicates a kid around 12 years old. Okay? Okay. So here I am wondering about, what does greatness look like? Is it me? Is it him? Is it us? What? And Jesus takes a child, and if I was a disciple, I would kind of want to interrupt him. All due respect, Jesus, but maybe you didn't hear the question, because we didn't ask you who was the cutest in the kingdom. Because if the question was who's the cutest, it's that little kid. What we want to know is about greatness. And he took a child and he put him in front of them and said, you become like this child. And I thought of that. I've heard a lot of romantic stories about children, how just become like a child because they're so full of faith and they believe. Sometimes they do, and children are... No, they don't. No, sometimes they do. What the disciples already were childish, but they weren't. I think the thing about a child that was so confrontational on them was that children are helpless and dependent. You leave this little child alone in the woods, and if they're not dependent on God, humbly dependent on my very breath for life, they're lost. And so Jesus' invitation to greatness, they're looking for a promotion. Who's the greatest? Who can sit at your right and your left? They weren't being invited on a journey upward to greatness. They were, by a child, they were being invited into a journey of descent. Unless you become less than you are, less full of yourself, less sure of yourself, less confident that you have the word. No, maybe you don't. Maybe you do, but if I would trust you more if you were more like a child, a little less confident of what you think you know. It's totally upside down. The message of the kingdom is so opposite. The spirit of this dominion, right. I know that comes from Genesis, and he gave them dominion over the world. And now they pick up this basically sword of, we're going to be supreme over the world in the name of God. It's a different religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great summary of it. And I think there's one warning here too. I don't want to overly psychologize about this, but I think another reason that Che An specifically showed up here is it relates to all of us. Like we all come to our understanding of faith with baggage, with a background, and then so some of the movements that people care so much about, where there's certain political issues, for instance, that just like they talk a lot in this chapter about how the abortion issue just drives a lot of at least the rhetoric around this movement and stuff. But Che An specifically comes from, a family that was persecuted in North Korea by communists. And so he's got this trauma in his past, I would say this generational trauma. And he talks about it a lot. He's like not rabidly, but I mean, he's anti-communist to the core. And he's come to equate the left in America with the communists who persecuted his family, and so it's like, to me, it's just a little bit of a warning where it's like, and I'm not saying this to rip on him. I think every one of us has these triggers, these broken places that people can push on those. They can push on that bruise or whatever, and get you to do a lot of things you wouldn't do in your better self. And so, because I read about him, and a lot of these leaders to me just seem like total frauds. I didn't necessarily feel that way based on just the way Matthew Taylor talked about Che-An. To me, he's a guy who has a lot of gifts and a lot of passion, and it's being misdirected to first a movement that I think has some bad structures around it, but then misdirected to support a guy who stands against everything that Che-An ought to believe in. And I think it's because I think specifically with him, there's something about where he started off as an anti-communist, and he was going to be on the side of whichever party was strongest that way. And it's where we can take some of our worldly brokenness into our leadership if we're not careful, and lead people astray. It's just something I want to point out.
Yeah, I mean, sticking with the psychological, I agree with that, but sticking with the psychological thing, there's a very binary way of thinking in this group. It's very black and white, and this party is the godly party, and everyone who opposes us is demonic. Not just communists; they're demonic, and so we're fighting Satan. We're not just fighting the Democrats or the Republicans, and I just that's
right.
There's a psychology there too, that is black and white, and has no time for or patience with nuance.
Right.
Wisdom, however, does.
Right. Exactly. So I think that's a good place to wrap this up. It sort of introduces people to the themes in this chapter, and then next week we're gonna get into sort of the political part of this. And that is into, so the way that Taylor, I'm just going to read the way that Taylor ends this chapter because it kind of summarizes it really well. He says, Che-An is an accomplished, forward-thinking church leader ushering in Wagner's second apostolic age. If he has his druthers, the apostles and prophets' spiritual oligarchy will continue to expand. And one day all of America, indeed all of the world, will submit to Christians under the lordship of Jesus Christ, which I think is, by the way, such a perfect way of phrasing it. The world will submit to Christians under the lordship of Jesus Christ, not that the world will submit to Christ. That's a very smart way that he framed that up. And then, but the NAR agenda goes far beyond apostolic declaration or imagined futures. Parts of what Wagner and his cohort have constructed is a dedicated, charismatic program and plan for Christian supremacy, undergirded by prophecy. That program is called the Seven Mountain Mandate, and that's what the next chapter is going to be about.
Yep.
So, all right, Dave. Well, thanks so much for having this conversation.
Sounds good, Pat.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.
Yep, it's fun. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.